this is going to be a lot more of a why discussion than a how discussion. So we're going to cover a lot of like, why would you use Tailwind? Why would you not? Rather than like, here's how we implement a 2-column layout in Tailwind, because honestly, like the docs are going to be a lot better than me talking at you and telling you how to do that. Tailwind has great docs. There's a ton of great content on the internet for how to do X in Tailwind. So we're going to be a little bit light there. We will look over some code examples, so you will see some implementation ideas. But as far as like actual tutorial, me coding, I did all that ahead of time, so we're not going to do a lot of live coding for this particular talk. So that was the spiel for this line. And then we'll just do quick introductions. I'm Chris Held, senior developer at Headway. I do help coordinate the dev meetups here. I've been a developer for over 10 years now, so I've been doing a lot of things in the web. I started with like jQuery and Bootstrap and kind of moved on from there. I also have done a lot of backend work. I've worked on mobile, so I have a pretty wide breadth of technology. A lot of it is in consulting. Headway, I put a little plug here, but the head of marketing got his plug in first, so we'll pretty much skip that one. But I will mention that Headway is hiring. So if you're interested in working with us, please apply. And we're hiring for design, development, product, just about anything. If you've got a talent and you want to work with us, don't hesitate to reach out. Okay, so first thing, what is Tailwind? Tailwind is it's a CSS library, and it's focused on utility. And in the next slide, we'll cover what is the difference between semantic and utility CSS. But since it's a CSS library, it has like a really wide breadth of things that it can cover. So it's not a React library. It's not a Rails gem. Like it's just anything that can render HTML can use Tailwind, generally speaking. So that I think that has helped spur its popularity. It's accessible via a CDN. Like you could just download the Tailwind CSS file. But the much better option is to have it as part of your build process. And if you're curious about how that would work, it's really, there's tutorials out there for just about everything. If you just put like your technology Tailwind into a search engine, like you'll get a great tutorial how to get set up, like whether that's React, Vue, Angular, Rails, Phoenix, anything basically. All right, so that's what Tailwind, CSS library. If you're familiar with something like Bootstrap or Foundation, it's in that vein where it's just CSS classes that you can apply to your HTML. So now we can talk a little bit about semantic CSS versus utility CSS. I think that generally people are much more comfortable and much more used to semantic CSS. And what semantic CSS is, you name your CSS classes in a way that makes sense to you. So if we look at this top example, this button has a class of BTN, which semantically identifies it as a button element, and then green. So if you look at this, just reading it, you can think, well, this is a green button. What utility CSS does is it takes the components that make up this BTN class and the components that make up this green class and kind of explodes them out. And it's a little bit of a thinner abstraction over your CSS. So here we see like py2, and from there you could infer that, okay, the padding on the y-axis is 2 units. px4 padding on the x-axis is 4 units. That's what utility CSS is essentially. Like Tailwind didn't invent utility CSS, and a lot of people have been doing their sort of like homebrew utility CSS. Bootstrap has some utility elements, but Tailwind kind of takes that a bit of a step further to say like, well, everything is a utility class, and then you just compose them to create your elements rather than doing it at the CSS level. So that's sort of the difference between utility CSS, semantic CSS. All right. So now we can go into some of the advantages of Tailwind. So one of the big ones, just taking a step back, a lot of my work professionally has been in consulting and working with different startups, moving around a lot, having disparate teams working on different applications with an organization. So like at Headway, we have 20, 25 developers. We're all split up and working on different stuff. So naming becomes really important, that we have a shared language that we can speak. And using Tailwind isn't unique in this. Like we could use some other way to enforce that naming, but it's nice to have consistency across projects. So if we're all using Tailwind, and we can move from project to project and not have that ramp up of like knowing what things are, where things are, what they're named. And also like naming is hard. Like I know it's a meme, but it's true, right? Like naming things, like it does take brain power to be like, well, should this be called network dialog inner container, or should this be called, that's not going to make sense to the next guy. That won't make sense to me in a month. Like you have to think this stuff through. But with Tailwind or anything that uses a shared language, like they've already done that work for you. They've thought about it, thought about how to make something declarative and easy to understand. So you can speak a shared language with other developers who know Tailwind, and it's very popular. So there's going to be a lot of people who are ramped up. I put co-location on here. So co-location is basically having things together. So you're able to infer your style just by reading markup. So when we look at an HTML element and we see the classes on there, after the learning curve of getting through that sort of initial, like, what does everything kind of map to in Tailwind, you can pretty easily look at an element and see what its style is, instead of having to look at that element, look at what its class name is, find the CSS file that class name is defined in, and then see what the styles are. It lets you work a little bit faster because you don't have to go through that exercise. You can just sort of look at your element and have a good idea of like how it's styled, and if you need to make style changes, what you need to change there. Your CSS stops growing with the project. This is a pretty big one too. So in traditional CSS and like global CSS, or even using something like Material UI or styled components CSS in JS, as you add new things, you're going to add new styles to style the new things you're adding, which that it's pretty obvious. But as you do that, naturally your CSS is going to grow. And if anybody's been on like a big project, how big those CSS files can get, or how big your just your CSS that's getting sent down to the client can get. So Tailwind helps with that. And Tailwind also has they have purging built in. So obviously, like all of the utility classes in Tailwind, there's a lot there. But the Tailwind build process is smart enough to just find the classes that you've used, and it'll like custom build your CSS for you. So you'll have a smaller packet getting sent down to the browser, so your app will be faster. They also recently introduced like a just-in-time compiler, which for local development is really speeded up local dev in Tailwind, where when you start out, the build process doesn't build your doesn't really include any Tailwind classes until you use them. So as you're using them, as you're doing local development, it's recompiling and adding those new classes into the DOM. And it's a really slick experience, and it's very quick for local development. So it's pretty cool. And then safe refactoring. So again, if anybody's worked on even a small application that uses global CSS, like refactoring CSS is a pretty hairy business, which leads into the previous one where you just create new classes for everything. And then that makes your CSS bigger, and then you wind up 2 years down the line like with this huge CSS file. And you can't do any cleanup because you're essentially scared to update anything because you don't know what uses what class. But I think that Tailwind largely solves that problem because the classes are set at the element level. So you can be confident that what you're what you're editing is just that element. So it largely solves that issue. I think that any kind of CSS refactoring will never be like 100% bulletproof safe, but for the most part, it is much safer refactoring than something like global styles. There are other things that solve this problem too, but Tailwind also solves it. Another thing that's not on the slide here that I have in my notes is that it's widely used. It has very wide adoption. It's very popular, and that is good. Like the Tailwind Labs, the company that runs Tailwind, like they are a profitable business, so you don't really need to worry too much about this just going away. Even if it just stops being used right now, like there's a lot of sites, there's a lot of resources that use Tailwind. So it is pretty safe as far as like a risk of, is this going to be around in 2 years type thing. Not quite like to the level of React, but it's very, I mean, it's very popular, and popularity matters when you're in open source, because you're going to get a lot of adoption. You're going to get a lot of help the more popular that you are. So those are the advantages. Now we'll talk about some of the trade-offs that you have to make. Obviously, there's no silver bullets in what we do. Otherwise, we'd all just do one thing. So one of the big trade-offs, and I think this is what drives a lot of people away from Tailwind, is your markup can get extremely hard to read. There's just like it's called, like a lot of people have said, like, oh, it's ugly. You know, like there's a lot of classes that you're adding to your elements, and in real use cases, your class names can get really long, which one, it can make it hard to debug from like the browser tools, and two, it'll make your editor scroll horizontally forever, because you can't put line breaks into your class names. You're essentially just composing a string. There is a tool that the people at Netlify built to sort of solve that second problem a little bit, that we'll look at the end when we look through some Tailwind examples. But that is a concern. Like you're going to have just a lot of classes, and your markup is hard to read. Your page weight increases. Obviously, you're putting more text into your HTML files, so the page weight of your HTML page is going to get larger. I think that increases the file size. There's a gain by not having to write as much CSS, so your style sheets get smaller, but some of that does get transferred to your HTML page, because like it's got to go somewhere, you know. I think with purging and with the way that Tailwind is pretty smart about what it includes, it's still a net gain, but I did put it in there because as I was doing research on this, that was another one of the things that there was concern about, was that, well, your HTML page weight is going to get bloated now because of all these class names, that's a valid concern. Doesn't work with web components. So if you're there, it doesn't support like a shadow DOM at all. So if you're using web components, you can't use Tailwind. There has been some like experimentation to sort of make it work with web components, but nothing substantial enough to say that it actually works. So if you're using web components, can't use Tailwind. Your vendor lock-in, again, this was one of the things that came up a lot in my research about sort of the trade-offs of Tailwind. So there is a build process associated with Tailwind, and you are kind of like, when you start using Tailwind, it would be very difficult to go off of that, like to move to something else. This seemed obvious to me, but it was listed a lot when I was looking at why people didn't like Tailwind, and vendor lock-in is certainly a thing, but that would be the case with Bootstrap. That would be the case with using Material. It would be a case with any package that you choose to do. And moving off of any of those packages is going to be painful. So that is definitely a risk, especially if you're thinking of converting something and you're already going through that pain of converting from a former solution. Like if you're converting from Bootstrap to Tailwind, like you may not want to feel that pain a second time. So definitely something to consider there. Additional complexity, both like for developers and for your build process. So there is an additional like configuration layer. And what Tailwind essentially does is it's doing like a mapping from a CSS property to a class. So you have to sort of learn that mapping while you're developing Tailwind. There's tools to help you, and we'll look at some of those in a little bit. But there is additional complexity there, and then it does add something to your build process. So if you don't have a build process, that might be a hurdle. Like if you're just running like, a PHP server that has Alpine or jQuery or something, and you're just you don't really have much of a build process, and this will require you to sort of update all of your CI/CD flows and just everything to get your app out there. That might be a significant hurdle. Most, I guess, modern web apps already have a build process built in, and putting Tailwind into your existing build process is not that hard. There's guides out there for just about everything. But if you are running like a custom solution or something that's much older, adding that build process could be an issue. So I put that there. And then last thing is a learning curve. Everything that we learn has a learning curve to it. I will say the Tailwind docs are great, and you're going to need them to start out. Because there is a little bit of a learning curve trying to remember, like, what do these class names mean? What do they map to? How do I do X in Tailwind is going to be like a very common Google search that you do, especially if you don't feel very strong on the CSS side. I think that having more CSS knowledge helps you learn Tailwind faster. But even if you're not great at CSS, you can still use Tailwind. And again, like, docs are great. There's tons of examples. You'll be good. But there is a learning curve there. And if you're already stretched, like if you're starting a new build and you're learning let's say you're learning a new language, or you're picking up a new framework, maybe don't add Tailwind on top of that. I don't know. I think that's certainly something worth thinking about, though. Like or think about like the makeup of your team. If you have a lot of people without a lot of experience, maybe that would be something that you would consider, going with something that everybody can move faster in. But there would be a learning curve to learn it. But once you get over the hump, I think that it sort of evens out. All right, so now we're going to jump into some different examples of sort of what Tailwind looks like, and what we would see in like a production app. So two meetups ago, Tim did a talk on Elixir. And it was Elixir if you're coming from a JavaScript background. And part of that was we spun up a website to kind of demonstrate the differences between Elixir and JavaScript. So that's this site here, and this is built in Tailwind. So it's pretty basic, but like it is a fully functioning website. It does some stuff that we want to demonstrate here. So the first thing that I have is like this footer component is very, very simple. It's just like some centered text, and then it has a link. And we can look at what the source of that is. Is this big enough? Do I need to go bigger for font size here? Can everybody see that? Taking that as a yes. So this is like the most basic Tailwind implementation, so it's a good example to start with. We see we have a class name here of P4. That means that we want a padding of 4 units. And then P4, we'll look at what that P4 actually means in a little bit here. I have the default Tailwind configuration, which is very instructive. And then we just have our anchor tag, and we have a P tag here, and we're saying text center underline. So this is like the ideal Tailwind, because it's not super long class names. It's very declarative, easy to understand. But as you can see, it's very, very basic. And then the next one that we'll look at is this kind of collapsible component. So this is a component that just kind of manages our open close state. Here, this actually uses a library called Headless UI, which is also built by Tailwind. and Tailwind supports that and maintains it. And that is, it's just a collection of React components that work nicely with Tailwind. And we'll look at Headless UI in a little bit here too. But this one is a little bit more advanced. So we look at this class name. This is where it starts to get kind of what, this is a longer class name. Buttons typically, if you think about it, like a button has a lot of styling that it needs to do. It has a lot of state, a lot of classes that need to be applied. So we've got a margin, we've got some padding, we have our width defined. This is, so we want full width, we want a border. Here's what we want the border to look like. We want it rounded. We don't want to focus on it. And this is even without hover states. So it can get pretty long. And then here is an example of handling CSS transitions with Tailwind. This transition component does a few things for us that are nice, but this is still this is basically what a class name you would put on an element to get your transitions. So here we're saying when you enter, just set opacity from 0 to 100 and have it take 300 milliseconds. So that's an example of an animation in Tailwind and how you would do that. So that is that's the collapsible one. And next, we're going to go and look in at configuration for Tailwind. So one of the big things about Tailwind is its configuration. It's super highly configurable. You do all of the things that you would typically put in CSS variables, you put into the Tailwind config. And there's a lot of things that you define in the Tailwind config that would have traditionally gone into your CSS file. So that is also one of the criticisms that people make is well, why can't I just define my colors as a CSS variable? Why do I have to put it in this theme? But that's sort of the way when you're choosing Tailwind as your tool, that's sort of what you agree to. And this is an example of a very basic theme. So it defines some additional colors, it defines font families, just extend. So extend is, there's a default config that comes through, obviously, which has pretty much all of the classes are defined in there. And we'll look at what the default config looks like in a second here. But you can extend it. You can say so spacing 128 is not a typical spacing number in a Tailwind config, but you can extend that and say, well, if when I say 128, I mean 32. When I say 144, I mean 36 rems. When I say 4XL border radius, I mean 2 rem. And then we can look at, here's the sort of default config for Tailwind. This is what you get when you run a Tailwind app just out of the box. And I like looking at this because it's very instructive as to what you can all override and what is sort of going on under the hood. So when we look at spacing, that's sort of the easiest one. So if I do P-1, I can see that that's mapping to 0.25 rem. If I do P-4, that's 1 rem, right? So if I'm saying anything dash this number, here's what that number is going to kind of correlate to as far as margin and padding. So that kind of illustrates where that mapping goes in, and it coming from just other tools and just learning global CSS first instead of Tailwind first. This was very helpful for me because it helped me kind of reinforce what that mapping actually is. And then here's sort of how animations are handled. This is something that I don't particularly love about Tailwind. They come with these 4 canned animations. And then to add new animations, you can't add them to a CSS file, or you can, but you'll run into some weird issues. you need to add them in the config. Like you have to say, when I say bounce twice, this is what I actually mean. This is what that mapping is. So that's sort of the vendor lock-in, sort of the buy-in talk that you'll see where like people have criticisms about Tailwind is like you have to do it the Tailwind way, which makes it hard to move off of. But we covered that a little bit already. And then there's gradients here. So this is just a great resource. So border radius, we saw they had 4XL. So when they were updating their configuration here, and they're saying border radius 4XL is 2rem, that would essentially update this list and say, well, when I say 4XL, I mean 2rem. And then there's box shadow. There's everything, every class in Tailwind, I believe, is represented here. So that's very helpful. So another good resource here is the Tailwind docs. So let's say you want to learn about the CSS grid. Let's look at grid. There you go. So, and just about, I just picked that one randomly, but like here's an example of how to do a grid in Tailwind, right? Or if we want to do a gradient. Shows you, here's how you do linear gradients. Like the docs are really, really good resources. I would definitely recommend, like, if you're working on a Tailwind project, have the docs up in a tab somewhere, or in another window, because you're going to use them, and they're very good. Another really good resource is this. This is also built by Tailwind. It's Tailwind Play. So when I talked about your HTML looking kind of ugly, like this is sort of the worst case, if I'm being honest, where you've got just like a lot of class names everywhere. This is also like, this is just this kind of an HTML page. Like it's not using React, it's not using Vue, it's not really using any kind of templating to help you here. But this is nice because you can edit this, or you can even go, you can edit your CSS. You can edit your configuration. So if we change this to purple, it'll update that. And if we change this to orange, it'll update that. And it updates in real time. So you can kind of see like, what am I, when I mess with these things, what are they doing? And then also we can go, let's see, what's one that's going to actually change something. So you get autocomplete here. It's actually going to change. We can change this to small 8. Here, font. And it'll update this stuff as you're going. So this is a great one. Like a couple of times, what I've done is just like delete all this and then try to if you're just messing with the layout, this might be a nice way to do it. And I think it would be a great way to learn. So if you hover over this too, it'll show you what this is actually doing as a CSS class. So if you look at like divide Y, that's what it's doing. Space Y2 is doing a margin top. So this is a great tool. I would recommend using this if you're learning. I think that we're through examples and now back into resources. So we looked at Tailwind Play. Let's look at Headless UI.
Hey, Chris.
Yeah, what's up?
We do have one question before we move forward. So if you want to, I put up on the screen here. So one of the issues with Tailwind is you have to do a mental calculation from pixels to Tailwind unit. Like you have to divide pixels by 4 to get to Tailwind units. Any thoughts on that, Chris?
Yes, I agree with you. You do. Yep, that is an issue. You do have to kind of do that like reverse mapping to get there. So that's a valid issue with Tailwind for sure. So I sympathize. And I think that the only, I guess, advice I could offer is that's something. You just have to get those sort of mental reps, and you kind of have to just get used to that. I don't know of a good solution for that. That's just sort of one of the trade-offs that you're making, is it's not directly your CSS, it's Tailwind's CSS, and you have to kind of do that mapping yourself. So yeah, definitely valid criticism.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, no problem. So Headless UI is a set of components that are built in Tailwind. They're built to work with Tailwind. You don't have to use Tailwind with them. They are kind of a standalone product, but they do a couple very nicely. Our Elixir for a JS dev site uses Headless UI, uses the I think we use Transition. I think that might be the only one that we use because it's a really simple site, but it's just a selection of UI widgets. They also have Tailwind also has a paid set of like pre-built React components, pre-built widgets that they offer as a product. But this is open source. It's for React, and they also have a Vue version. But if we look at some of them, like, it's pretty straightforward of like how if you know React, like this is sort of just standard React components, and they are all obviously customizable via class name, just like any other React component, and you can add your Tailwind classes there. So Headless UI is very nice. I liked it the time that we used it for the Elixir site. Another thing that's really nice if you use VS Code is the Tailwind CSS IntelliSense. This just gives you some autocomplete. It gives you this sort of IntelliSense here to highlight when things aren't working, and if you hover over, it does sort of the same thing that Tailwind Play does. This worked sometimes for me, but maybe you'll have a little bit better luck where like the hover over is showing you the actual CSS. But definitely would recommend that. This will help you stay in your editor instead of having to go to the Tailwind docs. And the more time you have spent in your editor that you're not switching tools, I think the better. So then it'll let you build your layouts much faster. And then I think the last thing that I wanted to cover as far as example tools is this class name template literals. So this was built by Netlify. Netlify is the largest company that I know of that is like switching to Tailwind. And I'm trying to find where that there's a blog post that they made where they were talking about their reasons for switching, which is it's really very good. If we don't have it here, we'll make sure that it winds up in the meetup notes for everybody to review. But one of the things that they called out that we also talked about is the horizontal scrolling in your editor to get to the class names. It's very frustrating, but you can't just have line spaces in, because then this is how it shows up in your DOM, and that's not good. So their solution is a pretty good one. Is you use template literal, you pass it into this function, and that just splits it on new lines and returns with a string. So if you have long class names, you can do this, and then it's also nice because you can do conditionals. So if you're using something like React and you need to do conditional styling, which is all over the place in just about any web app that manages state, like you can do something kind of nice like this, which is pretty easy to understand. So I would recommend using this if you have a Tailwind site and you see that your class names are getting kind of out of control and you don't want to have to deal with that. So I think that was what I had prepared here for our talk. So now if there's any questions, I would be happy to take them.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, be sure to throw them in the chat. But in the meantime, I'm going to just talk about some things that's going on at Headway. So as Chris said earlier, we are hiring. So for design, development, for product strategy. So if you or someone you know is looking for a new opportunity, be sure to head to our website, so headway.io. I'm just going to share my screen, actually. We have some upcoming events. Obviously, today we had the introduction to Tailwind, but next month, we'll be having a conversation with Alan Clement talking about finding value propositions that resonate using a new technique called simulated shopping. So you can check that one out. I know we're going to have some more design development events coming up. I know we're going to be talking about like design leadership, like growing and managing a team, and development leadership. And how we kind of think about that at Headway in the same vein. And then also for open office hours on August 11th, we'll be talking about just holistically creating an effective product team. So if you're interested in learning about any of those, be sure to be on the lookout. You can either subscribe to the YouTube channel to see those upcoming live streams, or you can head to our website and register. And when you register, it'll add it to your calendar and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, so be sure to head to our blog. We have a lot of great stuff on our blog, upcoming events, and as I said before, you can head to our careers page, and you can see what it's like to work at Headway, all the kind of benefits and stuff we have, how we think about things, but see all the different openings that we have here at Headway for development. Let's see if we have any of the questions come in. All right, here we go. Awesome. We got two of them from Fran, but here's the first one. Can you use standard CSS and Tailwind on the same project?
That's a great question, and thank you. Yes, you can. I don't think that the Tailwind folks recommend it, but you absolutely can. So the way that the Tailwind stuff sort of happens, and I should have shown this. Let me share again. Hold on. I'll figure this out again. There we go. All right, so this is what the CSS file looks like right now. If I just did like, you're essentially like, everything that you put after here is going to override this Tailwind stuff. So I think what a lot of, because there are people who are converting existing global CSS apps over to Tailwind, and that's sort of the technique that they're taking, as you add it after and then you slowly pull it out. But if you do need to ever override something that Tailwind's doing, and I think that that's fine. I think that that's a good like intermediate step to like to learn Tailwind, is like, if it's not working in Tailwind, like don't pull your hair out trying to get it to do the thing the way that you're supposed to. Just get it to work the way that you know, and then you can work backwards, right? Like you can work towards it, but just get that, get it shipped and then get it right in that case. So I think that, yes, to answer your question, you can use it in the same project. And then what libraries do you recommend for an Elixir app using Tailwind? Just Tailwind. just Tailwind. If you need like some interactivity with JavaScript, I think Alpine is a good choice for Elixir. But I think just Tailwind.
Here we go. So with React, can we have a global CSS and component specific?
You can, but I would caution that. I would be a little careful, because you don't want to expect that your global CSS is going to like affect that component. Like global CSS just in general is kind of problematic, because like it's hard to manage. It's not co-located. Like it's gonna affect things that you're not expecting it to. So you absolutely can, and in some use cases, I could see that as being a good choice. But I would probably stick to just doing it component specific, and then hoisting up things where you can, and just like creating components that are reusable that have the CSS you need. So yeah, good question though. You absolutely can.
Awesome. Yeah, I think we can wrap it up today. Thanks again to Chris for presenting today. Thanks for sharing all your wisdom and knowledge and your experience with Tailwind. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. So anything else you want to share, Chris, before we head out?
No, just thanks everybody for coming. Thanks for the questions. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Take care, everybody.